Okay, so hello, my name is Siri. I'm a research director at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, PRIO. So I'll talk for 45 minutes, which means that we'll take the questions afterwards. So if you have any questions about clarification, I think that would be fine to ask, but then just save up all your questions until the end and I'll answer them as best as I can. So I work on conflict trends, and this is something that I talk about a lot to all types of audiences. I think this is it's really important to talk about. It is not super fancy high-tech methodology. It's just very much descriptive data. But what I think is important is that it shows the conflict landscape as it is. We hear about Ukraine and we hear about Gaza. We hear a little bit about Sudan. But we don't hear so much about all the other conflicts going on in the world. So my aim when I present this is to give a broader perspective on what does the conflict landscape look like in the world today. And I talk about this to everything from academics like you to children. But what I also think is really important for you as academics, and this goes whether you are quantitative scholars or qualitative scholars, is to understand the conflict data, because that is used in our academic work. Both you will use it and you will read about it. So it's important to understand what it actually is. And by understanding what it actually is, we also understand what it isn't, and then we can start discussing what that means. Also, I think that by presenting the trends, which I will do, which goes beyond talking about how many conflicts are in the world and how many people are killed, but also try to tease out what are the underlying histories here that we don't see right away. But that can open up for new research questions. Because some of these things I can present to you and say, this is what the data shows, but I can't necessarily tell you what the mechanisms behind are. And that's what I hope all of you will study at some point. So I think understanding the data will give us some opportunities for research. So what I'll talk about first is conflict data and definitions. I'll look at the conflict trends, what the data actually shows us. Then I'll talk about conflict exposure, which is a different way of thinking about conflict, how conflict affects people. And finally, I say a little bit about the consequences that we see and that we can at least start seeing from what the data shows us. And as I said, this is what I want academics to get out of my presentation, is to understand research and conflict. We need to understand how researchers define conflict and what that means for what is included and what is not included. Some of the most fruitful discussions I have about conflict data is when someone asks, oh, but why didn't you include this in your data? But that isn't included. This is not like this in our country. Because when we have these discussions, we can say, sure, that's not included. But what does it mean that it's not included? And we can actually have a really good discussions about it. So this is the definition of armed conflict by international law. So international armed conflict, this occurs when two or more states engage in armed hostilities. So Ukraine and Russia would be. Or non-international armed conflict, governmental forces clashing with non-governmental armed groups. So a civil war. Those are the two sort of types of conflict that the international law recognizes. And this is what we think about when we say conflict. I think when I go out and talk about conflict without defining it or talking about anything else, this is what people think about, these two types. And that's of course fine. But as you'll see throughout this lecture, conflict is more than that. If we had more time here, we would have asked you to discuss a little bit what conflict could be. And it could be everything from, criminal, almost sort of political conflicts to frozen conflicts to high intensity wars. So armed conflict and violent conflict includes a lot. Okay. So now to the more sort of rigid and stuff. I use data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which is collected at Uppsala University. So the data collected is not collected by me or my colleagues at PRIO, but we have a very close collaboration with Uppsala. So they collect data every year It's free. You can download it from the webpage. They also collect data monthly so that you can get very current updates. So I'll start talking about what is called state-based conflicts. And this is includes what was in the international law definition. Conflicts between two states or conflicts between a state and a non-governmental actor. These are the state-based conflicts. So to be included in the data set, and here we have to be rigid, because if you're going to do quantitative data and you're going to study across countries or across time, you need to have the same definition. That's just the way it is. And then we can discuss the definition, but this is what they landed on. At least 25 battle deaths. And a battle death is someone killed in an actual fight in the conflict. It doesn't have to be soldiers or combatants. It also includes civilians. But what it doesn't include are indirect deaths. So people dying from starvation, lack of hospital, or if they're hurt in a bomb attack, for example, then taken to hospital and later die, is not included because it's really hard to count. If this count reaches more than 1,000 killed in a year, we call it a war. So we differentiate between conflict and war. Two organized parties, of which one at least is a government. And finally, it has to be politically motivated. And by that we mean either governmental, so someone wants to take over the government of the state, so a rebel group wanting to oust out the government, or it's territory, so you want to secure autonomy or even take control of the territory. So those are the two sort of politically motivated issues. That's relatively clear? Yeah. So just to say, and I'll get back to it. Of course, a conflict is just as bad if 24 were killed. It's just not included. Okay. So this is the figure that we most often show at PRIO to show conflict. This is how it develops. So the area behind there indicates the number of conflicts shown here, and the line indicates people killed. And I'll talk about number of conflicts first. So we can see several trends here. Starting back in 1946, we see there's an increase of conflict, increasing fairly steadily up until around 1990s. So up until the end of the Cold War. We see that what increases the most is this, I don't know, beige-ish area, which are civil conflicts. We also have this blue area, which I'll get back to. These are internationalized civil conflicts. Then we have this blue, dark blue area. These are colonial conflicts. They ended mid-1970s with the colonial area. And then we have international conflicts, conflicts between states, the orange. Okay. So the peak that we see around 1990-ish can be explained by two things. First, in the period before or during the Cold War, most conflicts were supported either by the US or by the Soviet Union. So they're all proxy wars in a way. That meant that resources were poured into these conflicts from either side. And it sort of never ended. It's just accumulated, all of these conflicts, because there were resources to sustain the fighting. However, when the Soviet Union broke up, the resources on one side dried out. It probably wasn't necessarily for the US to pour resources into the other side, and a lot of this conflict ended. That's why part of why we see this decrease. Of course, the other reason why we see a peak in 1991 or 92 is, of course, the actual breakup of the Soviet Union with all of the internal fights from the states that wanted to break free. And then, of course, they also ended. Yeah, of course, as sort of part of that entire breaking up of communism. But yes, you're of course right. So we see a decrease. Maybe I can, where is it? Okay. And it decreases until sort of the 2000s, where it levels out. And this is the period where, for example, Steven Pinker had his, at least, okay. I point up here. So, yes, so it levels out here. We were all sort of more optimistic, thinking we are moving towards a more peaceful world. There was less people killed in conflict. We, of course, had some very serious conflict in this period as well. For example, the invasion of Iraq. But in general, the level of conflict in the world was lower. And it sustained up until around 2013. And then we see this increase here. There's a couple of interesting things to talk about here. First of all, there's a huge spike here. And that has a very specific explanation. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's linked to Islamic State. So what they did in 2013 was to say all Muslim areas in the world will be included in our caliphate. What happened was that a lot of Islamist groups played allegiance to IS, and IS, in a way, became a part of a lot of conflicts around the world. And the way that the UCDP data is coded means that when IS became a part of a conflict, it became one more conflict because it was a new actor fighting the state. We had a huge jump with a lot of IS conflicts around the world. At some point, and I can't remember the year, but I think it's around 2016, IS were involved in 16 countries. So 16 conflicts around the world, from West Africa to India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. So across a lot of countries. So this is a very different type of conflict spread. We have never seen a group franchise in a way like that. Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, maybe a little bit, but just bordering countries. But this was like all over the world. That is one reason. We also see, coming back to this blue, I need to decide what to point or not, this blue area, which are what I call internationalized civil conflicts. These are conflicts where a third party, often a state or a third party state, supports most often the government in a country that is fighting a civil war with boots on the ground. So it's not just we support you, your fight, go for it. It's with actual boots on the ground. Well, what we have seen in the past few years is that more often a third-party state also supports the non-governmental side, the rebel side, with boots on the ground. So one example would be Ukraine before the invasion in 2022 in Donbass, where we had Russian soldiers supporting the rebel groups. Another example is the one that Trump has solved in DRC and Rwanda, where Rwanda is supporting the M23 group. They deny to do this, but it is quite obvious that they do. So these are what we maybe could call proxy wars, but we don't have a category for it. And by the way, I don't think he solved that conflict. We can talk about that later if you'd like. So we see an internationalization of conflict as well, with all of these new internationalized conflicts. The thing with these are that they are harder to solve and they last longer. So this is not a good sign for the conflict landscape. And finally, we see the orange part. And as you can see, from around 2004 and until 2010, we hardly had internationalized conflicts in the world. Hardly countries were fighting. And then we see an increase. While these numbers are small, we do see a trend, increasing trend, and in 2024, we recorded 4 internationalized conflicts, which is the highest since 1987. And I'll show you towards the end that this is a trend that we should definitely be worried about. So just the number of conflicts for 2024. So 61 conflicts in a total is the highest number since 1946 that is reported for international states, international conflicts, 38 civil wars and 19 international wars. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the black line, which is the number of people killed. So as I said, these are battle-related deaths, and they are conservative, mainly because for the data to be reported in the dataset, it needs to be reported in a news story, a report, or somewhere. And we need to be able to sort of verify that. Hence, numbers are conservative. But I still think that they show the trend. So in 2024, 130 people were killed in state-based conflict. Yeah, I'll get back to the split between countries. This was the 4th most violent year since the Cold War in state-based conflicts, only surpassed by the previous 3 years. When we look at this line, we see there are peaks. We will always have occasionally large conflicts. That seems to be the way that the international society works, right? We'll have big ones. This one is Ethiopia, Eritrea. And we have this one is Sri Lanka, Syria, of course. But then what happens from around 2019 or something, we don't just get occasionally large conflict. We have gotten a lot of really big conflicts sort of taking over from each other. So of course, starting with Syria and Yemen a little bit earlier, then we had the Afghanistan when the American troops left. That increased the number of people killed enormously in that conflict. Then we had Ethiopia, which people hardly knew about. And that's slightly embarrassing to say, but as a conflict researcher, I didn't even realize it until I got the data. I was like, what? And it's, I think over 2021 and 22, our data record almost 250,000 killed. That is almost as much as Syria for the entire period of the conflict, or Afghanistan for the entire period. It's a lot, and we didn't know. And part of that is the data didn't come out. NGOs were excluded from Tigray. Journalists were excluded. Internet was blocked. So very little information came out, and there wasn't that much to report from on a monthly basis until sort of the big reports came out and we could see the actual numbers of people killed. And of course, we had Ukraine starting in 2022, and then Gaza. So we have all of these really big conflicts taking over from each other. So the number of people killed are sustaining really high. And we can see that from this level, even though even if Syria had just been one of those one-off conflicts, the level of people killed have sort of moved up. And from looking at data for 2025, it's going to sustain at that level. Okay. So I'm going to dig a little bit more into the conflict or the conflict data to try to show you even some more of these trends and stories behind the data. So first of all, this is what I didn't mention with Islamic State. So the light blue are just all conflicts, other conflicts. Dark blue is the IS conflicts. And we can see that they start, around 2004. And this is the conflict in Syria. And then, Syria and Iraq. And then here, 2014, it increases. And then the dark blue area is sustaining. We thought, or at least I thought, that maybe this would become less when IS were beaten in Syria, but it didn't. So it seems like IS have been able to develop their own organizations, and they have several different organizations now in these countries. You have one in West Africa. You have one in Afghanistan called KIS. You have one in India and Pakistan, which have their own names and are their own organizations. So they are sustaining beyond what's going on in Syria. We do see that battle death. Sorry. So we do see that in the past years we have had fewer IS conflicts, but then we also see this yellow. And the yellow indicates something called the JNIM conflicts. This is a Islamist organization in West Africa, which merged. There were four organizations, I think, Al-Qaeda being one of them, and became one. And they're fighting in 5 West African countries. So you're sort of seeing the same trend. Islamist groups fighting in several different countries. And with both IS and JNIM, we see that the number of Islamist franchise group conflicts is quite sustained. And even if we took those away, the number of regular conflicts have increased, but it wouldn't be as high. So IS is the only group that have fights in so many other countries, except now JNIM. Most of these other conflicts are either interstate conflicts between countries, or they are conflicts between non-governmental groups in that country. So they don't spread to others. So they are sort of their own separate conflicts. But I'm singling it out because I think it's important to understand that this is a big driver of why we see so many conflicts now. I don't think there's other conflicts I could categorize in the same way. Just quickly on the battle death as well. Yes, over there. It's okay. So the question was, how do we separate the IS conflict from other Islamist conflict in the region where they're sort of merging? Yes, good question. And I'm not coding the data, so I can't answer 100% correctly. But it has to do with how they identify themselves. So, for example, in Nigeria, Boko Haram was one of the groups that pled allegiance to IS, and IS became part of conflicts in all of the Chad Lake region. I'll get back to that as well. But it hasn't been. So there's also been fighting between Boko Haram and IS. So I think it's been clear who's sort of responsible for the attack, and it's used news sources. But since I'm not the one coding the sources, I can't sort of 100% say, but I'm pretty sure that it's if IS say that we did this, that's quite often, I think. So what I'm talking about fits within this state-based conflict definition. And of course, there's a lot of violence outside of that, which I'll talk about as well, different types of conflicts. So I think what I'm talking about here is quite clearly conflict. But there are other gray areas, which I don't think is that easy to look at, especially sort of Latin America is a good example of that, and I'll talk more about it. No, not exactly what you talk about. Yes. Yes. So armed conflict, that is what we code. And then I think your point is, of course, really valid, that there are an increased tension around the world with cyber attacks and with threats and trade wars, etc. But that doesn't really fit into the definition we're talking about here. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, that we see this heightened conflict level, which is not violent conflict. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. It just doesn't fit into the definition that I'm talking about. And that's what I said at the beginning, that this is what I talk about, this definition, because it has to be rigid and has to be sort of what we fit. That doesn't mean that there are other things that are really interesting to look at as well. It just doesn't fit into the data I'm presenting right now. But I'm happy to discuss sort of that, how that affects, for example, violence. It could potentially affect violence. Okay. It's yeah. I realize I'm spending way too much time. Okay. So another thing that's important to look at when we talk about this conflict, or to think about, is that when a country can have several conflicts, because the way that these data are coded are actor-based. So, and several actors can fight the government in a country at the same time. So in Syria, for example, we had at least 3 conflicts going on at the same time. It was IS versus Syria, or versus the government. It was SDF, Syrian Defense Forces. And then you had this weird category of other non-governmental groups fighting the government. That means that Syria had 3 conflicts. So what this graph shows are, this is the dotted line is the same line with number of conflicts as you saw, but these bars are conflict countries. So countries that have conflict. And what we see is that while the number of conflict increases, the number of conflict countries remain quite stable. Not fully stable, but quite stable, which means that in the conflict countries, the situation becomes worse and more complex. For example, Myanmar have had up to 8 conflicts. I think like about half of all the conflict countries have more than 3 conflicts. So that means that it's not just sort of sorting out the conflict between the state and actor A. You have to sort out the conflict between the state and actor A, B, and C, which of course becomes more complicated. And I'm going to talk about non-state conflicts afterwards, which also complicates this picture. Okay, so just to show you also how this number of conflict was inflated by IS. This is the Lake Chad area. It's Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. They all have Boko Haram conflicts. And when IS also got involved, at least Cameroon and Nigeria had IS conflicts. So in this area, border area among these 3 countries, we had 5 conflicts. And for most people outside, this seems as 1 conflict. When we also look at the rest of these countries, blue dots are dots here, and the few blue dots here are Islamist conflicts. So this is the JNIM conflict, and the yellow ones are other conflicts. So in total, these 3 countries had 8 conflicts. That means 13% of all conflicts. So this also says something about how the number of conflicts are slightly inflated by a few countries. But it also underscores how complex and difficult it is to solve the conflict in these countries. And then to this idea of a 25 battle death threshold. So the story behind that threshold was in the 1990s, Peter Wallensen, who was the peace and conflict professor at Uppsala, he talked to Singer, who was the one who coded the correlates of war data, which was the predominant data set on conflict in the 90s and the 80s. They had a threshold of 1,000. And Peter Wallensen said that, but what about all the other conflicts? There's a lot of conflicts that doesn't reach 1,000. It's usually somewhere between 5 and 10 every year. And then Singer said, well, you go and code that. And he did. So that was how the Uppsala data collection started. So originally, this was a very low threshold, sort of surprisingly low threshold. And the critique it gets now is like, oh, but what about all the others that doesn't reach 25, right? So it's sort of there's a different discussion, which is fine. And we do have data for that as well. So just to show you how this can affect the data this is Bangladesh here. And the blue line indicates battle deaths for the conflict over from 89 to 2014. That's how long it lasted. All the gray bars indicate the years where it was above 25, hence it was included in the data. And all the white is when it just dipped below, so it didn't include. And that, of course, can give a very different picture of the conflict compared to what I'm showing you here, because here it's quite clear that in 1995, the conflict didn't end. It was just dipping, or in 2000. You do see that here and here, a period of more calm, but it apparently hasn't ended. So this gives us a much clearer idea of that conflict. So it's important to keep in mind that this threshold can sort of drop in and out of the conflict of the data set based on it. Okay, so other types of conflicts. I'm going to talk about the conflicts that the UCDP data collect. And of course, there are other types of conflicts that we could talk about as well, but I don't have data on it and I don't know them so well. The one is non-state conflicts. These are use of armed forces between two organized groups, neither of which are the government of a state. So two non-state groups. You have to have at least 25 battle deaths in this as well. We have three types of non-state conflicts. It's communal violence. This is very typical in Africa, where you have herders and nomads, for example, clashing, or ethnic groups. These are low-level organizational groups. Then we have election violence, which there is not that much of that fits into this category. And then we have organized, bigger organized groups, such as IS, for example, or drug cartels in Mexico. These are very organized groups that fight each other. One important difference, except that the state is not involved, is that there is no requirement for an incompatibility of the non-state conflict data. So it doesn't have to sort of take over the state, or it doesn't have to take over territory. So this is violence, not with an aim of doing anything. Not something like they're just fighting each other for the fun of it, but that's not it. But this is where I get back to this gray area between crime and conflict. Because even if these groups do not have a political aim as territory or governmental take over the government, they do have an aim, and it could be for drug cartels to secure their trade or to secure their business, right? But it does have similarities to political conflicts beyond what just crime would be. So it is really this gray zone area. Also, gangs in Brazil and Honduras, Ecuador, would also include in this category. But it's really difficult. And non-state conflicts are really broad, from everything from herd nomad conflicts to drug cartels in Mexico. It's huge, and we don't know that much about them. But this is what the trends from 1989 and up until now looks like. We've seen a huge increase around 2011, especially with the formally organized groups, so the big groups. I think there's two reasons why we see this. First of all, I think there has been an increase in this type of conflicts. And the second is the data collection. The data was started collecting in 2011. And it's quite clear that it's easier to collect data as it happens, as you get the news sources, than it is to backdate, especially back to 1989, right? Also because there were not as, we have just much more sources now. So I think part of this is because this is when they started coding the data actually at the same time. But that means that what is then potentially flawed with the data is that they should be much higher here, suggesting that the problem here is actually true. But I don't think we can find a big theoretical explanation for why we see that big jump in 2011. So the third category of conflicts that Uppsala collects is one-sided violence. This is use of armed forces against or by a government or a non-state actor against civilians. So this is, as it suggests, one-sided. It's not fighting between two groups. You have to have at least 25 deaths. Also, just extrajudicial killings are not in custody are not are excluded from this data. So the number that we see in this graph is not indicating number of conflicts, but indicate number of actors that have used violence against civilians reaching more than 25 battle deaths. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 was included in this category. So whenever we show battle death data, including the Rwandan genocide, it's impossible to show any other trend because it just dwarfs the rest of the data. So I often take it out, not to say it's not important, but to actually be able to show some other trends as well. But this graph shows the number of actors using one-sided violence. Blue are governmental actors and yellow non-state actors. And we can see that there's been an increase in the same period as we saw increase in conflicts, state-based conflicts and non-state conflicts. But this increase is among non-state actors, particularly. A slight increase as well in government actors, but not as much. I don't have the battle death data here, but they are more stable. We don't see the fluctuation as much as in conflict battle deaths. But we see the increase that we see is among the non-state actors. Yes, terrorist attacks would be in this category. But if the terrorist attack is in a conflict, so if it's done by IS in a country where they're also fighting a conflict, it is sometimes difficult to sort of, is this a one-sided violence or is it conflict? But all of the attacks in Europe, for example, the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester would be in this category. Because that was more than 25 people killed. And also the terrorist attack in Nice, for example, would be here. And these are often groups that take responsibility for it. Also, the Palestine-Israel conflict is slightly difficult now. The attack on 7th of October is coded as one-sided violence, most of it, because it was a lot of civilians killed by a one-sided not a one-sided group, non-state group. But everything else have been coded as a conflict, because of course now consider that a genocide, but that's not reflected in these data. And how they're going to deal with that, I don't know. That's luckily I'm not the one coding the data. I had to make that decision. But that's, I mean, if you're wondering how this data reflect the Israel-Palestine conflict, it is, as of now, a civil war. That's how it's coded. So to get into this category, one-sided violence, the attack is on the civilians. And the civilians wouldn't fight back. If one person fight back, it's a crime, right? But in a conflict, there are two parties fighting each other. So right now, the Israel or the Gaza conflict is the Israeli state and Hamas. But if you think of it as a genocide, then it would be the Israeli state against the civilians. So it fits into this one. Killing, one-sided killings of civilians is what they call genocide.
So, but you said that at least ideally the Rwandan genocide will be included, but that also presents the same problem. The Tutsi did have their own militia, the FPR, fighting back. And so we say, oh, since the FPR was fighting against the Interawe, then we don't really consider the genocide because it's part of a wider conflict in which the Tutsi are fighting back. I don't think that's particularly convincing methodologically.
So for Rwanda in 1994, there's most of it falls into this category, but there is also a quite large share of the fighting that falls into a conflict category. So you have both, because of course they were fighting back from the two militias, but the killings of the civilians fall into this. So you have both, which probably will be the case with Israel-Palestine as well.
Conflicts versus one-sided violence. If you think about, for example, category apartheid, Israel-Palestine, every year a state one-sidedly, I don't know, shoots how many people on checkpoints, etc. Is this all falling into the conflict category, or like where does that go? Because I mean, also there are some, like, I mean, I don't want to get into the discussion, but like the colonial conflicts ended in 1970. Like there is, I mean, the definition of the data, not in my understanding, but in terms of that is a very specific definition already we place on the data in terms of the interpretation. If we say, okay, we let, let's say, category of colonial conflicts end at 1970. But there are many different understandings of that. And I guess these are two questions that I'm having. One is about the apartheid category. The other one is about, we're working with a lot of political definitions here as well. But we can take the second one to the discussion afterwards as well.
I haven't checked how the Israel-Palestine conflict splits between the two categories over time. So it might be both. I can check that, but I can't answer your questions like properly full. Sorry.
Let's try like to stay on the clarification if needed, and then the questions we move to the end of the presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about where we actually see these conflicts. So the Uppsala data code the conflict data, but they also have a data set, which is the basis for all of the data sets, which is called the GED, the georeference event data. And what this data set does is that it codes all conflict events. And here it doesn't, they sort of just code everything that happens continuously. So some of it doesn't reach 25 battle death, but it's still coded if the conflict was active in the past 3 years, I think. So that's why I could show you the graph over Bangladesh, because I had this data, which showed that we did actually have conflict events, but it didn't reach 25 in total. So it wasn't included in the bigger data set. But this data also includes georeferencing on where the conflict happens. So all of these dots are areas where you have conflict events. Color-coded by red are state-based, blue are non-state, and yellow are one-sided violence. And there are a couple of things that are interesting. While the map is small and the dots are big, but most conflicts do not cover the entire country. Most conflicts happen in just a small area of the country. You have, of course, some exceptions, Ukraine being one, the Philippines. Yeah, those are so big, I realize now, so it's hard to see. But for example, the DR Congo, here, you see that the most conflict events happen in the eastern parts. In Yemen, most conflict happens in the western parts. This is also where most of the population lives, so that makes sense as well. The other thing that's interesting or important is to see how geographically the different types of violence spread out. So we see that in Latin America, we have mostly non-state conflicts. It's really just Colombia that has conflict events, state-based conflict events. And then we see quite a lot of one-sided violence in Africa. So we can use this map for other things. And one thing that we use it for is to look at conflict-exposed populations. So when I talked about battle death, that is often used as a way of indicating how serious the conflict is, how many people are killed, and the intensity of the conflict. But that's not always a really good measure. So we have made a different way of measuring, which is complementary, I think. We try to assess how many people are exposed to conflict. And the way we do that is we pick this map and we draw buffer zones around each of the events where at least one person was killed. So circles that are 50 kilometers. And then we say that this is a conflict zone, and we count the people living in that zone. So we use GIS software where we overlay and then extract the number of people living in that area. Of course, again, as with the conflict data, 50 kilometers is just arbitrary size. We have assumed that people living within 15 kilometers is somehow affected. But depending on what we're looking at, 50 kilometers could be way too small or way too big. So if you're thinking about children's access to school, it's probably way too big. Very few people walk 50 kilometers to get to school, right? So then maybe 10 kilometers would have been a better measure. When it comes to health access, people might be willing to walk 50 kilometers to get to hospital once a year because they got sick. So it's a little bit of that's what we ended up with. We felt 25 was too small and 100 was too big, so 50. Okay, well, what we see when we do this is that we get this graph. So in 1990, less than 600 million, which is a lot of people still, were affected by conflict. But in 2024, we found that almost 1.4 billion people. That's more than a doubling over 30 years. Of course, this could also be related to what I talked about with data collection, that we are now better at identifying the events. But still, even if we consider that in the past 5 years, we've been as good at collecting this data, we see an increase. The dotted line shows the share of the world population that live in conflict. And in 2024, more than 16% of the world population lived within 50 kilometers of a conflict event. That's a big share of the population. But of course, here we look at everything. It's 50 kilometers and at least one person killed. It could be 1,000 people killed, or it could be one person killed. So, or it could be one person killed once or one person killed every day. That doesn't tell. So we tried to dig into this a little bit. This shows the intensity of the conflict in the country. So what is how many people got killed in conflict in the country they live? And we see that most of the people living in conflict, more than half, lived in countries with more than 1,000 people killed. And then there are very few that live in these low intensity conflicts. Yeah. Yes. Now this graph shows a different picture. Here we have looked at how many people live close to an actual, or to actually people being killed. So here we see that most people, the light blue area or turquoise, are where how many people live 50 kilometers within 1 to 24 people being killed. And that's the vast majority. About actually measuring women and not the population as a whole, but the share would be the same. So about half of the people living in conflict live in low intensity conflict. And then the next category is between 25 and 99, and then we have 100 to 999, and the green small area is 1,000. But still, if we take the 3 top categories, that's 1/3 of all the people living in conflict. So I still think it's quite devastating number. And even if it's only one person being killed, living in a peaceful place, it's so much better than living in a place where people get killed in conflict. Okay, so finally, I'm gonna say something about some reflections I've made looking at the conflict data. First of all, this is a graph I made working with the Women, Peace and Security Index that I work with, where we look at the share of women living in conflict. So it's basically the same as share of people living in conflict, just half, actually a little bit more than half. And then on this side, we have the Human Development Index. And then the size of the bubbles here are the number of people killed in conflict. So a couple of things that I would like you to notice. First, we have the big bubbles, Ukraine, Palestine, then we have Mexico. They are all serious conflicts. They have a lot of people affected. Most of them are more than 80% of the women are affected. Drug cartels, it's a non-state conflicts. Yes. But when we look at this Human Development Index, it does have a downward trend, meaning that the more people living in conflict, the lower in the score you will have on the index. But we also see that a lot of these conflicts that have the highest battle deaths are above this trend line. However, these countries in the square are countries where you have, it's like a medium-sized conflict. It's between 2,000 to 6,000 people killed every year. But a lot of people are affected. Somewhere between 60 to 80% of the entire population live close to conflict events. And they are below the Human Development Index. These are conflicts that we don't really pay that much attention to at the moment. And if we take that fact, together with the fact that aid has been cut a lot in the past year, not just by the USA, but that obviously being the biggest, but also other actors, these are countries that will struggle more with coping with conflict because there is less money for education, health, food security, and it is harder to get out of conflict. And you also get a better breeding ground for recruiting into conflict because the alternatives are getting fewer for young people. So at some point, the only viable alternative to survive is to join the rebel group. And I think this is a very, very scary scenario, and which I think and I fear we'll see more of the Sudan cases in the coming years in Africa with huge humanitarian crisis, even though the conflicts do not sort of expand to the size of Gaza and Ukraine. That is one of the things I worry about. The other is international conflict. So as I showed you in the first graph, we've seen an increase in numbers, even though 4 is a very low number, there's an increase. But I looked at the data up until August this year that has been coded. And all of the red stars indicate internationalized conflicts that will be coded next year because they reached the threshold and they are between 2 governments. Then the yellow star is a conflict that hasn't reached the threshold yet, but has been in the data last year, for example. And here we have 7 red stars and 1 yellow. So that's potentially a doubling. And so these conflicts are, of course, Ukraine, Russia. This is the yellow one is Afghanistan, Pakistan. You have India, Pakistan. You have Thailand and Cambodia. Then you have Yemen and Israel, and Yemen and the US/UK. That surprised someone. There's been quite a lot of bombings by the US and UK in Yemen. Then you have Israel and Iran, and you have Israel and Syria. And then, of course, we could have potentially added a star for Israel and Lebanon. But the conflict between Israel and Lebanon is not between Israel government and the Lebanese government. It's between Israel government and Hezbollah. But it certainly is a conflict between 2 countries, or at least involving 2 countries. Just to point out that at least 3 of the conflicts that Trump claimed to have solved are not on this map. So Rwanda, Congo, as I said, it's not a conflict between the countries. It's a civil war in Congo supported by Rwanda. Ethiopia, Egypt, it wasn't really a conflict. There was a dispute over the dam that they're building. And then Serbia, Kosovo. There's certainly been some tensions, but there hasn't been any conflict or violence. So it's quite easy to solve these conflicts. Okay, that was what I had.